Here come our friends. All right, people getting signed in here. Excellent.
No, Ryan, I can see not in presenter view right now. Good.
Yeah, I've got it. Okay. All right. Well, let's not waste any more time. Let's get this started, and I will turn it over to my friends Ryan and Khalil and let them do the thing that they do so well.
Thanks so much, Laura. Yes, we're so happy to be back with you all. I do see some familiar names, so it's great to be able to kind of wrap up a nice series like this with you. So this is part 3 of this motivational interviewing series. If you've been with us, tools for change talk is what we've called it. Really trying to kind of hone in on the importance of understanding change talk when we hear it and helping foster it, massage it, help people move in the direction of changes that they'd maybe like to see in their lives and that we'd like to see for them. If you're new, just want to quickly say my name is Ryan. I use they and them pronouns, and I am one of the 2 co-founding trainers of Heartset Training Center. And this is what we do. We get a chance to kind of talk to folks across the country about housing first practices, harm reduction practices, other best practices for service delivery. In this Tools for Change Talk series really comes out of the fact that motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice under the umbrella of the evidence-based practice of housing first. So it's really core to the skill set of supporting people in supportive housing settings and ensuring long-term tenancy, despite whatever setbacks may pop up. And so we just think it's super valuable and super important skill set to have in our tool bag, along with a number of other things. So I'll kick it over to Khalil to say hi real quick, and then I'll push us forward.
Alrighty. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I am the other co-founding trainer of Heartset Training Center. So with Ryan, full time, I am a therapist. That's what I do. But a lot of my experience and what I care about most is in the substance use and mental health space, specifically in housing settings, I'd say. So yeah, happy to be here and wrap up our motivational interviewing series that we've been doing.
Yeah, and I do want to say this is the wrap up of this series, but we're going to be doing these community table sessions all the way through the end of May. So if you're liking what you're hearing, or you're perhaps more interested in some other topics, April's topic is going to be all about harm reduction in the Therapeutic Alliance. And so really kind of inviting people into that Therapeutic Alliance through this harm reduction lens. And then we'll wrap up in May with a series on vicarious trauma. So each of these are 3-part series. And here we go with the 3rd part of motivational interviewing. So really quickly, our shared expectations that we often like to talk about in the beginning. We're expecting to engage in a dialogue with you all. That's so much more fun than speaking into the void. And so if you have it within you, if you have the spoons for it, we would love it if you would use the chat to chime in. We'll ask some rhetorical questions, but we'll also ask some direct questions, kind of wanting to hear your feedback on the material. We're going to ask for some ideas about how to shape statements when we're speaking to clients in a motivational interviewing context. So if you have something to contribute, we want to hear it. Sometimes we won't agree with one another about what we're saying and what we're hearing. And if you're hearing something that sounds at odds with an approach that you've taken, or what has worked with you in your career, we want to hear that too. That's all valuable. I think we all learn from that. So don't hold back. However, we are under a time crunch, right? We have a kind of a tight hour and a half together, and we want to get through kind of a lot of material. So there may be times when we're in dialogue that we'll say, all right, we're going to kind of wrap up that conversation. Let's move on to the next one so that we can make sure to get through all of our content. So it's not that we don't want to hear what you have to say, but there just may be times where, for the sake of time, we want to make sure that we keep moving. Final expectation is that we're going to offer a link to a session evaluation at the end of this session, and we want to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear kind of what kind of critical or supportive feedback you have. We learn and grow from all of that. And if you complete that session evaluation, you'll get an automated certificate of attendance from us fairly shortly. So expect materials in your inbox. We have some supplementary materials that we'll share links to today, but we'll also email them, copies of the slides, and that certificate of attendance if you tap into our session evaluation. All righty, here we go. In terms of objectives for this session, this third and final session of this series, we're really wanting to hone in on change talk, right? And so our first objective is that by the end of this session, you've developed a little bit more skill in identifying change talk statements. We'll talk more about what that is again. We also want you to be able to list at least 3 skills that could be used to elicit and strengthen change talk. Things that you can kind of walk away with today that would allow you to coax from people, to evoke from people some of that change talk in the direction of changes that they want to make. And then finally, by the end of this session, we want you to be able to describe the use of ORs in each of the 4 tasks of motivational interviewing. And so you'll see that this session is really shaped around the four tasks, of which we talked about 1 last session. And so we'll cover the remaining 3 today. How we're going to get there. We are going to do a really brief review from last session. What did we cover? What did it sound like? Then we'll dive into exploring the 3 remaining tasks. So the 3 tasks that are remaining in the life cycle of a change process with a participant resident is focusing, evoking, and planning. So we'll go into some depth about what each of those are and some related skills that support those tasks. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps and hopefully some questions. So we'll sprinkle in some engagement through there. Hopefully we're not just talking at you for this hour and a half. And I think we'll all learn and grow a little bit together. So here are our review points. We've talked already kind of in the first session about the way that motivational interviewing is a particular way of talking with people about change and growth. And we're focusing on strengthening their own motivations towards change, right? And so 2 points there. We can use motivational interviewing alongside other practices that we already are doing, right? Other evidence-based practices, other ways of being with people. It's a supplementary tool set that is meant to elicit, strengthen, encourage motivation towards change. So that's point number 1 there. And point number 2 is we are not trying to make people make change, right? We're not trying to get them to go places that we want them to go, directions that we want them to go. If you see motivational interviewing pop up in really kind of coercive environments, for example, maybe prison or immigration type settings, probably not that appropriate use of motivational interviewing. We're not trying to make people change. We're trying to help people understand what changes they want to make and then ease the process of that change for them, kind of help smooth out the process of change for the folks. Next, ambivalence is a really normal part of change. We all feel multiple ways about big changes in our life. I can count on a lot of reasons why I do want to make this change, but there's a bunch of reasons why I want to stay right where I'm at. That status quo feels nice and comfy. So that's what ambivalence is, and it's made up of change talk and sustain talk. And so we will once again talk about a little bit about what those are and how they sound, because that's the key skill here, right? Understanding when we're hearing change talk allows us to move it forward. We talked last session about the ways that there are some traps to avoid when we're attempting to kind of work with people in a motivational interviewing context. The fixing reflex, where we get a little nervous about change, or we're feeling a sense of urgency to help people make change. And so we want to fix things or tell people what to do because we're nervous or we're scared or we're feeling worried about our participants. We also talked about the way that resistance shows up. And when we're faced with resistance, maybe it's an us problem, not a client problem, right? Maybe it's a thing that we need to figure out how to approach people differently. We might be tripping ourselves up accidentally when resistance comes up. That's just communication that we're doing something a little off. And then finally, we talked about the expert trap, where we take on the role of expert and not as a partner with folks. The persuasion trap, where we're trying to persuade people to make a change, and they're fighting tooth and nail, right? Like they're taking up the status quo arguments every time we try to persuade. The time trap, where we're feeling too spent for time, and we're trying to do too much too quickly. We're trying to engage them and set a goal and meet that goal because we know that their time is short in our program, right? Or the outcomes are needed to happen quickly. But that can trip us up. And then finally, the wandering trap, where people haven't always had somebody who's such a good listener as you. And so they take it and run, and they'll talk for an hour straight, and we're not even sure where we are, right? So those are some traps that can pop up. Just wanting to kind of make sure that we're aware of those and avoiding them where possible. Finally, OARs. OARs is our kind of key tool set to help people share their stories, to help them feel heard, and to allow us to be quite accurate with our empathy, right? Not just having empathy, but reflecting and mirroring what people need from us in an accurate way. And so OARS allows us to do that. So what is OARS? OARS is open-ended questions. Here's an example of an open-ended question, right? Tell me what it's like to live on the streets. Not a yes/no question. It's one that encourages a lived experience to be shared. It's open, right? There's no endpoint there. It's just starting to crack open the door for somebody to tell their story and to show their expertise of their own life. We've also got affirmation. And we're pointing out again that affirmation is different than praise. It's very specific, and it's targeted towards the changes and strengths that we see that are going to be supportive of change, right? So here's an example of an affirmative statement or an affirmation. In spite of these setbacks, you keep trying to quit using. That's a really nice reframe of somebody who's had some relapses, right? But we see that perseverance, and we're highlighting it because that's a key strength that person has, and it's going to serve them quite well on this journey. Next, we have reflective listening. And we talked about some kind of in-depth ways that reflective listening looks, but here's one example. Somebody says, I'm feeling kind of down today. And we'll finish the paragraph for them, like you don't have much energy, right? And so we're reflecting the emotional content of what somebody is saying. We're reading between the lines. Another way we could have done that is to say, you're not feeling great today, right? Almost word for word what they said. We're mirroring back to them to allow them to feel heard and to check our own understanding about what we heard. And then finally, we have summarizing, which is just a collection of reflections, all those reflections that we heard somebody say for the last 10, 20 minutes. We're going to tie them all up with a bow and share it back to them. And we're really going to focus on the kind of things that they said that are moving them away from the status quo and moving them in the direction of change, right? All the reasons for change that they themselves gave, I want to give that right back to you in a summary. And so I'm sure you're quite familiar with summaries, trying to kind of pull all the threads of what somebody said together. But in this case, making sure that we give them back all the change talk that they said so that we encourage more of it. All right. I've been talking probably way too long on this little review. Apologies. Just want to really quickly check in. Are there any questions about what we've covered so far? Just give folks a moment to kind of process. I said a lot, but I said it kind of quickly. Want to make sure you're on board with me. Okay, I'm not seeing any feedback. Let's keep it moving. So we talked last session about the task of engagement, and we talked about the way that sometimes we need to go slow to go fast when we're talking about change, right? And this can feel hard because sometimes we think we know pretty clearly what change needs to happen for folks, and we skip past that rapport building, that partnership building, that opportunity for folks to share about themselves while we engage them in collaborative work, right? But once we've done a good bit of engagement, the next task in motivational interviewing is to do some focusing, right? And so we may still come back to some engagement. We may need to return and kind of re-tap into people telling their stories and giving us their reasons, sharing a bit about them, and doing a lot of reflective listening. So engagement underpins this task of focusing. But here we start to talk much more about goals. And so the clear question about focusing is, where are we going, right? And we need to ask this question sort of metaphorically when it's time to start to set a goal, right? When we have heard from somebody that there is some discomfort in their life about something, about some of their behavior, about their environment, about something that's happening emotionally for them. And so here we say, where do we want to go with this, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to identify some goals so that we can move together, right? Um, it's really important, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. I know this sounds quite obvious, but in order to be motivated as a human being, having a clear goal is a kind of key component to that, right? It's hard to be motivated without something clear to be motivated toward. And so here in this task, we're trying to be as clear as possible about what's the work that we're going to do together. Um, so we're going to try and do some clarifying of what changes that person might make, and it's going to be similar if you're familiar at all with harm reduction principles of this concept of practical and realistic. And so what I mean by that is, I may have a great idea for a change task for you to make, but if it doesn't fit into your life in a clear way, you're not going to do it, right? And so perhaps it's familiar to you to have a client sort of promise something that they'll do, and then the weeks go by and they never do it. Well, I venture to guess that either there's some avoidance happening, and so there's some resistance. They may feel like you're pushing them too fast or too far, or they're outside of their comfort zone, or it may not be a very practical change that you've suggested, right? And so trying to really tap into something that's going to fit a person's life and their habits in order to make this big change. I do want to say that our expertise does matter here. We do get to weigh in, whereas perhaps earlier in this series we've said it's your client's changes, it's your residents' changes to make. We do still get to play a role. We're in our roles for a reason. We are doing this work for a reason. We know quite a bit about these systems often. And so that expertise is valuable, but we want to really make sure that we are clear that our expertise exists to support a collaborative process with this client. And so doing a lot of consent-based tapping into that expertise is critical. And what I mean by that is asking, hey, can I share a little bit of something I know about Section 8 vouchers? Or can I, I've talked with a lot of landlords in my career. I wonder if I can offer some tips. And if they're open to that feedback, great. But if they're not, then our expertise may be actually a barrier in that sense. I like this statement for motivational interviewing, this next bullet point that you see here, which is, it's not a goal unless it's shared. And so often we have sort of goals in mind for clients, but unless that's a shared goal, I think we're getting in our own ways, right? So when you're thinking about what goal to work on with a client, if there's not a shared experience there or a shared sense of work towards that goal, I think it's worth rewinding and doing a little bit more engagement to find out what goal maybe is worth pursuing.
Ryan, can I ask a clarifying question?
Please, yes.
When you say a shared goal, does this mean a goal that us and our participants can agree on, or a goal that is named out loud by our participants?
I think a little bit of both, right? They have to name it out loud, but they're in our care for a reason, right? They're in our programs because things have not gone well, right? And so we do have some skin in the game. Our programs have some skin in the game about very specific types of changes, broad scopes of changes, right? And so if I'm in supportive housing setting, one of my main goals is always going to be keeping somebody housed, right? And so when we can agree on remaining in this apartment as a goal, that's a shared goal, right? They've been able to sort of like state something that they want, that matches, we're in alignment there, right? So there has to be that alignment of what we want for them or what we are there to provide, as well as what they want for themselves. That's a great question too, because somebody may have this goal that doesn't fit your program at all, and maybe you're not qualified to support a person towards that goal. I'm trying to even think of one, because some of our supportive housing settings do so much in so many areas of a person's life, but um, I'm just imagining that there are certainly goals that we're just not qualified to support people through, right? Um, that's not going to be a shared goal. We're not going to be able to help a collaborative process with them.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Khalil. Um, okay, so goals are going to show up in a number of ways when we start to identify them, when we start to name them. Maybe you've talked with a client that has a really straightforward goal, right? There's not much focusing we need to do at that point, right? They sort of know what they want. It's a clear and specific goal. And we might very quickly be able to move on to the next task of motivational interviewing, of evoking, right? Um, but often the goal is a little bit murkier, and we need to do some work to clarify and to move from the general to the specific, right? Um, so here we want to be really careful. I'm just kind of pointing out this wandering trap that is likely to come up in this phase, in this task, where people have a lot to talk about, many challenges that they're facing, and so trying to listen really carefully to the key challenges and what changes they actually want to make, and keep people on task with that, right? So that we're not just talking about everything, the universe of possibilities, right? There are some key skills that we'll find in this task. We're going to do a lot of reflection. We're going to do a lot of clarifying. Do you mean this? Is this what you mean? I'm hearing you say this. Can you share more? Right? So doing a lot of asking, um, so that we're really clear and accurate about our understanding about what steps people want to take and towards which goals people want to move. Moving from general to specific. And then another skill that we're going to see in a moment is the bubble sheet. And this shows up a lot in motivational interviewing. Any questions so far about this task? Is this making sense to folks? Great. Great. I love it. I saw a yes. Yay. You're there. I see you, Vicky. Folks, please feel free to interrupt or raise your hand or stop me, divert me if you feel like we're off track. We want to hear from you. Okay. So sometimes folks have a goal that is somewhat clear, right? But that goal has a lot of different ways to get there, right? Um, what do we do? And here we can help folks choose a path, right? And what we can do is we can sort of create a list of possibilities. And this is where our expertise comes in, right? What do you think? How do we move in this direction? Can I suggest an option, right? And so we sort of lay out a bunch of options on the table. Here, I'll give you an example. A person has a pretty clear goal. I want to pay my rent on time, right? They are at risk of eviction and they've really struggled to pay their rent on time. Their landlord is breathing down their neck. Here we can see a pretty clear shared goal. We're a housing program, right? We don't want to see people evicted, ending up back on the streets or couch surfing or whatever. So we're in alignment. And what we can do is start to kind of do this in a visual way. And this is the bubble sheet skill that I mentioned earlier, right? Where we have a list of possible paths towards change, and we get to sort of choose between them and prioritize. Um, and so this tool can help us structure our conversation around options. So if the goal is to pay your rent on time, maybe we can consider setting up a savings plan. We can consider exploring employment. We could consider doing some proactive budgeting. And I'm a big fan of the honest budget template, if you've ever heard of that, where even illicit activities might be listed and we're kind of approaching that without judgment. Or maybe there needs to be an accountability system. Here are all the options that I'm seeing. Is there anything else that you would add to this list? We could ask, right? And then we start to prioritize. Which of these sounds like something that you might focus on first? What do you think next if that doesn't work out? What about next? And so we're just choosing amongst a series of paths so that we actually know what the change movement is, right? We know which direction we're going. So that's the bubble sheet activity. And again, a visual way to kind of structure our conversation. At other times, the goal may not be as clear, right? And so what we're doing here is we're trying to clarify from something really broad concerns, to something that's actually we can chew on, we can work towards, we can actually make some progress. And so in this example, somebody's goal is, I want to stay housed. Well, what do you mean by that? That's quite a bit bigger than I want to pay my rent on time, right? Paying your rent on time may be one of those steps. Maybe taking out the trash has been the issue, right? Your apartment's getting some critters, and the landlords and other residents of that building don't like it, right? Maybe you're finding yourself sleeping outside, even though you have an apartment, and you're not there for your home visits with your case manager, and so maybe trying to figure out why that's happening and whether sleeping at home is a goal in itself. Maybe limiting guests is the thing that's going to help this person stay housed, right? Maybe they're at risk of eviction for that reason. They have too much foot traffic happening, which has been a common story in our career. So in this case, you might hear something from somebody like, "Hey, hey, what's wrong?" And they're like, "Everything. It's all going down the tubes." We have a lot of clarifying work to do, right? So when somebody's concerns or their distress is quite generalized, or perhaps they're feeling discouraged or overwhelmed about the possibilities for change, there's too much to think about, or maybe just that their hopes for change are vague, we're once again able to use the bubble sheet to kind of hone in on a menu of options, moving from the general to the specific, right? So those are two sort of ways that we'll approach this focusing task. This has also been called agenda mapping, to use the bubble sheet to do this. And once again, it's about being on the same page and having a clear idea about a goal. And so I want to turn to you folks. We talked about ORs a little bit. And once again, that's open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. And so I want to ask, if somebody said this to you, what examples of ORs would you use? I want folks in the chat, if you could, to sort of write maybe either an open-ended question. What's your next question that you ask? Is there an affirmation that's worth offering here? Is there a reflection that you would use? I want folks to sort of practice these ORs statements in response to the challenge that's being presented on the screen. So a resident says, I want to stay housed. Where do you go from there? What's your ORs? And I'm gonna put these in the chat too. What ORs actually stands for. There we go. Yeah, I see some stuff coming in. How will you do that? Yeah, I like that. It's an open-ended question, John. Nice. Ooh, Anthony did a reflective statement that digs a little deeper. That has some depth to it, right? That's not just repeating back, mirroring word for word what somebody said, but you're doing a technique called continuing the paragraph. I want to stay housed so you won't be homeless. Excellent reflection. Kirby says, what do you think would keep you from staying in your place? Kind of like asking, what's the barriers, right? What is, I think Kirby, you're kind of doing the thing where somebody's like sleeping outside. They're not coming home. What do you think would keep you from staying in your place? Corey says, that's definitely something we can work on. What barriers or concerns are you currently facing? Yeah, trying to clarify. I'm hearing some engagement there in your open-ended question, Corey. And if I could offer one tip, Corey, I see you sort of validating the concern, which is great. And I might offer a reflection rather than that validation that you offered, right? You're scared about losing your place. what barriers or concerns are you currently facing, right? So kind of really trying to bring it back to what they're saying and draw out more of it. Khalil's example, what might be some of the steps we can take to get there? Inviting them to offer the steps. Oh, there's so many good ones, y'all. I love Brandon's open-ended question. What would staying housed look like to you? Yeah. You're going to hear a lot there, Brandon, right? You're going to hear about how long they want to stay housed and is this the apartment they want to stay in? And perhaps even what do they like about their current housing? It's a great open-ended question. Vicky is offering a reflection. Staying housed is a very important part of being self-sufficient. I believe you're on the right track. Interesting. I like it. I like the first part of your reflection, Vicky. And for the second part of your reflection, I might suggest an affirmation here, right? Staying housed is a very important part of being self-sufficient. You seem to be quite, I don't know, quite tuned into that, right? Offering a statement on their perseverance might be a nice affirmation to offer there. Great. These are such good examples. Thanks for chiming in there, folks. Anything else you wanted to add here, Khalil, before I move on? Great. Okay, so that's the focusing task. I presented it quite quickly, I think. I think we might be in this task for multiple sessions sometimes, right? It doesn't go quite so quickly. And so kind of doing a lot of open-ended questions and reflections and summarizing is going to allow us to kind of hone in on what folks want to do. Great. All right, I'm going to kick it over to you, Khalil.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So Ryan walked us through the task of focusing, right? Where do we want to go? I think is the question there, right? Is that right, Ryan? That's the question. Where do we want to go? That is focusing in, right? A lot of times our participants come with many complex needs. So many things might be going on in our lives that could really use some attention, right? So when we can support them in narrowing this down to how us or our agencies might be able to support them, we might be able to do some more work, right? But the next question we're going to ask is, why would you go there, right? So we're gonna get into the task of evoking now, which I think sounds maybe the most important. We could probably make an argument for all of these different tasks being important at some step of the way because they are, right? They are all included in those 4 tasks. But when it comes to evoking, what we're doing is getting participants to name and strengthen and develop and grow their reasons for why they want to make this healthy change in their life or movement toward growth or a goal that they've had maybe for some time, right? So the question we're asking here is, why would you go there? And already, before we even read through any of these bullet points, when you ask someone why you want to do that thing, they're going to defend why they want to make this change in their life, right? Which is change talk. So that's where we're going with this and how I think is a helpful way to just understand evoking generally is getting people to defend why they want to do the thing that we're doing together. So it's important to know that in the evoking task, we're calling forth what is already present, right? Motivational interviewing isn't about installing these messages in somebody's brain or these goals that we really think are great for them. It's about uncovering what they already might know and think are great for themselves, right? And that might start with exploring the perceived importance of making a change or taking a committed action to something, right? Why is this important to you? Or is this even important to you, right? That is this important to you probably is really important to emphasize when we are focusing and clarifying what a client's goals are, right? But getting them to talk about why this thing is important to them is going to just naturally put somebody in a position to be naming all the things, all the reasons they want to change, and all the good that might come from this movement. Which is a vehicle for empowerment, right? We're getting folks to tell us what they want for their lives and empowering them to tell us, rather than, some traditional like outpatient therapy spaces or housing settings and case management agencies. might do the opposite, right? Here's what we're working on. Here's where we're going with this, right? So when we can allow participants to say that, that's also how we might be able to identify some of those shared goals that Ryan was talking about in the beginning, right? What are you coming to this space with? What does the agency hope to do and provide for folks in the community, and that collaboration beginning to take place. Moving toward a plan of any action usually requires some good, healthy reasons, right? We're getting participants to name those things, say them out loud, and hoping to strengthen them, make them bigger, help them grow and evolve in those reasons during our work together. Ryan also talked about ambivalence in the review of last session, right? So tipping the decisional balances toward the pros, right? When somebody has a list of reasons why they want to change and don't want to change, what we're going to do in the evoking task is hopefully bolster their reasons to change, right? Making it more likely that they can take some actual actionable actions maybe. And then we want to be remembering darn cat. And these are going to be statements that participants are saying that you will be able to pick up on. The D is going to stand for desire. So when someone says something like, I like this thing, or I would love to do this thing, right? They're expressing their desire to change a specific thing in their life, right? Do we have a darn cat slide, Ryan?
We have it in the notes. You know what I can do? While you're talking, I have a great tip sheet that I just need to be able to link to folks. So I'll link it in the chat so you can see all of those.
Awesome. Thank you. And then there are other things we can highlight it in the speech and just the things that participants are saying to us, right? So that R is going to stand for reasons to change, right? I don't want to keep going to this wound care appointment. I don't want to keep having to have this conversation with my landlord. It's annoying. And some of that also sounds like need, the N, right? Here are the things, here are the reasons I need to make this change. My health might be at risk. I need to be in communication with my family. And really what tuning into these statements that participants are saying is helping us do is that skill of attending, right? So there's three skills here on the right side of the screen, say attending, inviting, and strengthening. Attending is really just being able to be aware of these opportunities in the stories and experiences that somebody is sharing with you, to say, oh, I hear desire here, right? Or, oh, like I hear more change talk here, right? Just being able to notice and pick up on these things when somebody is actually speaking with you and sharing with you and being vulnerable, so that we can use that, right, to our participants' advantage. All these things are there. We are uncovering, right? I think that's an important thing to remember. And then there is the skill of inviting, which encompasses a bunch of different skills that we're going to break down a little more. But this is, again, getting clients to say outright what's going on, what they'd like to change, and really being as verbal as possible in naming some of those things. And then the work of strengthening those things. They can name them, they can talk about why, and we're going to do what we can in our work together to really support participants in their growing confidence toward achieving those goals or that change.
Yeah, just wanted to call out that I dropped a link in the chat for a motivational interviewing cheat sheet. This is not one we made, but I think it's one that is pretty nice and comprehensive. It has more than just darn cat on it, but it does indicate all of the components of change talk. So desire, ability, reasons, need, commitment, activation, and taking steps. You'll find all of those on there, as well as some other tools that we're talking about today.
Thanks, Brian. Alrighty, so now we're moving on to what it looks like to actually invite change talk. And these are specific motivational interviewing techniques or tools that are talked about. And the first is going to be directional questions. So again, people, when they come into your space, when they meet you for the first time, there are already some changes in their life that they'd like to make, right? So we really want to help them uncover their why, right? Why would we go there? So directional questions are going to lead us somewhere, right? These are going to be open questions that we know are going to be answered by some change talk, right? And we might be able to frame these in a way that is a little more directional than we're used to, right? If we think somebody's desire for a change that they want in their life needs to be bolstered a little bit, we might ask a question that elicits some sort of desire response, right? So what that looks like is getting a participant to express what they want, what they wish for, what they like, what they love about this change or this goal in their life, right? So what it might look like to ask a directional question directly to bring out some change talk is, I'm trying to think of an example on the spot. Why would you want to make this change, right? Very simple. Why do you want to do this? I actually think there's some examples in the chat that folks already gave that are really directional. What makes you want to do this, right? And immediately their response might sound like, I wish I didn't have to sleep outside anymore, right? There's desire there, right? Or I'm tired of going to the emergency room, or I'm tired of experiencing withdrawal symptoms, or I'm tired of being unhoused, or I want to be housed. Those would be the desires, right? Yes, awesome. There are some good examples I see in the chat here. So directional questions are a tool that we have in our tool belt, but I talked about the desire piece, right? But we have all of the rest of the letters in darn cat that we can be getting from folks as well, right? So when it comes to the A, ability, that really deals with someone's self-perception or their confidence, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that they can actually make the change that they want to make, right? So it might look like asking a question that sounds like, what are the things you'd need from me that could help you do that, right? That could help you stay housed, that could help you change your relationship to substances, right? So we can go through each and every one of those letters in darn cat and make these directional. And again, what this is doing is participants are naming change talk, the reasons they want to change, right? And they may not be doing that in other spaces in their life or in like casual conversation, right? But with you being your best motivational interviewing self, you have the ability to get them to say these things. There's also a tool called the importance ruler, right? This also is going to be a tool that we can use to get participants to name and start talking about the why something is so important to them, right? So this is, maybe you've seen this in other trainings, maybe even with us before, but we can ask clients quite simply, and visual tools are helpful sometimes, on a scale from 0 to 10, how important is this change to you right now? Right? This is helpful for us and also helpful for participants, right? If we are really frustrated over participants not changing, something like this might tell us, this actually isn't important to a participant right now, right? Maybe we switch gears or maybe we're working on another goal if we have that ability within our agency to kind of shift things around in that way, right? But what's going to be important here, because this is a really simple tool, right? How important is it to you? Point 0 to 10, right? But how you're talking about this and the questions that come next are probably going to be the most important piece here, right? If somebody initially tells you on a scale from 0 to 10, being housed is exists at a 4 for me right now, right? That's a pretty low number on an importance scale, right? And if our goal is to get clients to engage in more change talk, we're not going to ask them what's going to make this number higher for you, right? What's going to bring you to a 5 or a 6? We're going to ask them, oh, you're at a 4? Why not a 2 or a 3, right? And they're going to immediately start defending why this is a 4 for them and not a 2 or a 3. right? Which is going to be, I'm naming positive things about being housed is what that's going to look like, even though it exists on like the lower end of the importance scale to them right now. We can also engage in the skill of exploring extremes. This is also something that I think is pretty simple to do, and maybe you've heard it named some other things before. Um, if you've had any other sort of like trainings on really just talking in general with participants and people who have needs and want to make changes in their life. But what this means is we're going to be exploring if this was never a problem in your life, if this thing didn't happen to you, if you could make this change completely tomorrow, how would your life be different, right? Similar to the miracle question in clinical spaces, right? If you woke up with no depressive symptoms at all, how different would your life be, right? Is what that might look like. And also on the other end, right? If things stayed this way in your life, right? What would life look like for you? Right. Um,
And specifically, like the bad things about what life would look like, right? If you
yes.
didn't make any change at all, what would be all the worst things that would happen?
Yeah. Thanks for adding that, Ryan. Because again, if this didn't change at all, people might start to say, well, it's not that bad because like I've been doing it for my whole life so far, right? That is actually sustained talk. So we want to be really careful that we're not evoking sustained talk, and we want to include those words like what is the worst possible scenario if this doesn't change at all for you, right? Because then they're going to start to talk about why they need to change and what the worst thing that could happen is. This isn't a scare tactic, right? We are exploring, the extremes of this. What's really good, what's really bad. And people are going to talk about why they want to make this change. Looking backward and looking forward, again, is a skill that sounds exactly like what it sounds like, right? It might sound like, what was life like before substance use? What was life like before your homelessness experience, right? Um, and we might also ask about specific struggles, right? Um, how have you moved through grief before in your life, right? Um, And participants are going to immediately start recalling on probably their own personal experiences with themes of like resilience and working through things that have been really hard in their life, right? Um, I have been doing some like crisis response work recently for organizations who like experience like a big event, and typically that is like the death or like the sudden loss of an employee on their staff. And one of the things that I've been asking folks that just evokes so much tears, and I had no idea that this would be a thing, is I've been asking folks, or I've really been saying in the form of a question, leaving it open, I have the feeling this isn't the first hard thing you've experienced in your life, right? Or this is not the first time you've done X, Y, and Z or felt this low. And that's because when traumas happen in our life, when big things happen in our life, it can bring up a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So even if it is not the here and now, we might be able to recall examples in our life where we've moved through something in a way that we're kind of surprised that we did, right? So evoking that from a participant is going to evoke some good change talk, and that is what we're looking for. Um, and the same thing about looking forward, and this also sounds like exploring extremes on like the positive end, right? But um, what would it look like after changing this thing successfully, right? After paying your rent consistently for a year, or after making every therapy appointment you've ever been scheduled, right? What would life look like? Um, and then we also have the idea of exploring goals and values. We have a whole slide on this, but motivational interviewing might encourage us to get participants to name a list of your values, right? Tell me what's important to you in your life right now, right? Um, and does this maybe like high risk behavior or way you're living right now how does that impact the things that you care about the most, right? Is it helpful? Is it hurtful? Is it disruptive in any way to the goals and values that you have in your life currently? Anything to add here, Ryan, before we move on?
I just wanted to call out that the final bullet point is directional reflection, and similar to the directional questions, we're reflecting back to people some example of darn cat, right? Of desire, ability, reason, or need that we're hearing and giving it back to them. And so I wanted to call out that Anthony actually gave, I think, a good example of a directional reflection in the chat earlier. The question was, or the statement from the participant was, I want to stay housed. And Anthony's reflection is, so you won't be homeless. And that is a reflection of something that Anthony thought that they heard being said, but wasn't physically said with the words, right? So it's a deep reflection, but it's a reason why this person wants to stay housed, right? You're offering a reflection, sort of a question also, but to me, I would love to take off the question mark there and just leave it as a period, because I think those are often the most powerful reflections where we say, so you won't be homeless. No, 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 that's not the reason. Fine, that's fine. We'll go with whatever reason you say. But like, I'm digging in there, and I think this might be part of it, and that is going to elicit more change talk. So that was a great reflection there, Anthony.
Thanks, Ryan. And I like that example because if a client says, no, that's not correct, you didn't do it wrong, right? That is
Right.
the reason that you are doing this, right? For that clarity. And to let clients know that they're being seen and heard, right? I want to have you tell me what your experience is with this big thing.
Yep.
Awesome. So I think we have a good amount of examples of this in the chat. We've talked about some, but invitations might sound like, why do you want to do this? How much does it matter to you? What reasons are there for you to do it? How important or necessary is it? These all highlight different skills when it comes to like an invitation, but what we really want to stray away from are these things on the right side of the screen, right? These are bad examples, and actually might be the way that we are getting clients to engage in more sustained talk, which we are trying our hardest to avoid here, right? So the idea of asking, why haven't you changed? Someone's going to give you all the reasons they didn't wake up and make it to that appointment, right? Because I went to bed late, because I'm tired, because I don't think I can do it, right? They're going to give you real reasons that maintain staying where they are, and maybe maintaining ambivalence, right? That decisional balance there. What keeps you from doing this, right? This is actually something that I say a lot, and I'm working on not saying this in the therapy space, or saying things that sound a little different, right? But it's very normal, like, to instinctually ask somebody what is in the way, right, of making a specific change or a goal that they have in their life, right? But what they're going to do naturally is like tell you all the reasons they're continuing to engaging in behaviors that they want to change, right? A very normal thing. You probably do this with your friends, with your family. This is just like what's not helpful right now. It's so easy. I think that there's some like science words to this, but our brains have like a natural negativity filter, right? It is so much easier to think about what is wrong and why we can't than it is to think about why we can, and the ways that we might be able to move forward. What do you like about, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I just think this is like such an awesome conversation, because I think I even saw some examples of this in the chat where people are like asking about barriers, and that's like a very natural thing. Probably your supervisor is like, ask them what their barriers are. And I do think that there is a place for asking about barriers, but here we're trying to evoke reasons for change. We're talking about values and like, why do you want to make this change is the question, remember? Not why are you stuck? And so I agree with Khalil. I have often found myself asking that same question, and trying to get out of that mindset is hard.
Mhm. And then the last bullet point here says, why can't you just do it? I mean, I'd argue we probably shouldn't say that ever in any context, but another thing, people are going to tell us why they can't. They know why they can't, right? I don't think participants are typically as unaware as we might say they are in our documentation, right, of the challenges and the needs that they have. And they will be able to defend why they didn't show up on time, why they aren't able to reduce their use, why they aren't able to make rent payments, show up to these meetings, go to the hospital, etc. So again, don't say these things on the right. I hope that that's visually clear. What we want to do to invite change talk are these things that you see here on the left side of the screen. We've talked about goals quite a bit so far. We've named them, but like, and values and goals we've talked about. But what if a participant just doesn't know, right? What if they haven't been given the space to know or to really think about the things that they care about the most? I think a lot of times when we exist in survival mode or when our participants exist in a survival mode, we can really lose sight of the things that are maybe most important to us because we are trying to survive, right? So asking participants to explicitly name these things out loud gives us something to work with as helpers, right? These are reminders. I like to think of this as kind of like healthy accountability, right? Because if you look down, the second to last bullet point says, value behavior discrepancies are common, right? We are not always acting in accordance to our values, right? Let's say I really value health and wellness and I haven't gone to the gym all month, right? I haven't moved my body or worked out in a way that has been intentional all month. My behavior isn't necessarily lining up with that value, right? Does it mean I don't value it? No, but I might need some support in finding ways I can do the thing I want to do and make the changes I want to make to move toward that change or toward that goal, right? And I think in the housing context and with our participants, right, someone might really value the idea of stability, right? Certainty. I'm gonna come home, I have a place to come home to that is mine. I don't have to leave. It is secure, right? But there might be some behavior discrepancies in their ability to like be home for home visits to maintain that housing, right? Or sign the necessary documentation to continue receiving that housing, right? It doesn't mean that they don't value that thing, right? It doesn't mean they don't value housing, but it does mean there's a little bit of a discrepancy here, right? But that we can use to the participant's advantage. Again, right? You know, you're telling me you really value like staying housed, right? And I notice you haven't been home for any home visits. We're naming out loud what the discrepancy is, right? It's important that when we are naming those things out loud in the way that I did, right? I know you really value being housed and maintaining your housing status, but you haven't been home for any home visits. It's important that I approach that and voice that out loud with as much curiosity as possible, right? This is not a challenge. When we are challenging and engaging in like confrontation in this way, it's going to bring out some sustained talk in folks, right? If I'm challenging you, you're going to defend yourself. That is natural, that is normal. We're going to do that as well, right? So exploring values helps to evoke clients' motivations for change. Why do you want to do this thing? And I also want to make a note here that acting in accordance to our values doesn't always feel good. I like to talk about resilience when we get to things like this because I don't know how I feel about resilience or grit broadly, but the one thing I am sure about is that when you are being resilient and when our participants are being resilient actively, it doesn't feel good, right? This is something that we know in retrospect. This is something we can look back on and say, wow, I really did that hard thing, right? And there is something about doing the hard thing that is probably in line with the participant's values. So evoking what that is, what got them through this hard time before, and being able to loop that back to a value and something really important to their life is another way we might be able to move toward change talk. Yeah, that's what I have on this. Actually, the what feels important to you right now in this current moment is probably going to be important as well, right? If you are the lowest you've ever been in your life, but you really value something like, I don't know, finances is the first thing that comes into my brain as just like an easy example. There might be some other things we need to do for you first, right? Before you can really dig in and engage in this other value that you have. And this goes back to the survivability piece that I think I was naming before, right? My like broad like life values one will change and evolve because that's what happens as our lives change and evolve, right? But I might need to value different things right now than I will need to value in 5 years, right? The next slide is an example of a specific exercise that I use in my own therapy space. You don't have to read all these words because I'm going to explain it to you. But basically, for participants who have never been given the opportunity or have been walked through naming specific values in their life, this is an activity that you might do to kind of really hone in on those. What I like to say to my therapy clients who are engaging in this activity is this seems really fluffy, like a soft activity. How is this going to help, right? What we are doing here in the motivational interviewing context is probably clarifying some values, right? We're focusing in on what's important to us. But also we're putting some words to maybe some feelings and thoughts of things that are important to us, right? So the reason I think this activity is harder than it seems is because this full activity lists 60 different values, right? Or like 50 something, and there's a space to like write in if you don't see some values here that you really care about. And then it asks you to rank them, right? Between very important, quite important, and then pretty much not important at all, right? So you go and read through all these values, all sound really great, right? Of course, I want acceptance in my life. Of course, I want beauty, to be caring. I want compassion. I want to contribute, right? I want all these things in my life. But then we can click to the next slide, Brian. At the end of the activity, after you've gone through what, 58 of these values, and you've said how important or not important they are to you, it asks you to pick 3. Okay, you just looked at 58 really great things that might be cool in your life. Pick 3 of them, right? How are these going to contribute to moving toward this goal or this change you want to make in your life, in the therapy space, in the housing setting, right? In relationship to your substance use. And then these are tools we can use again for some healthy accountability, right? How does not showing up for this really important meeting we're looking forward to all week or all month align with your value of self-development, right? I see that here on the slide. And that it's a healthy reminder, right? Here's what we're working toward. Here are the things that are going to help us make those changes. And again, I think an important piece of this, the underlined portion at the bottom says, what's most important to you in this domain of life right now, right? So I want to know all your values, what you really care about, right? What feels the most important right now? What needs to be our guiding values for maybe this specific change that you're naming in your life? And that is also clarifying, which Ryan talked about later. And I think we'll even talk more about in this training, the idea of moving from like broad ideas and then making them smaller and more accessible to us, more specific. All righty. Oh, go for it, Ryan.
Oh, okay. So the same kind of slide that we showed before, we want to ask it this question again, right? So again, highlighting the importance of open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarizing statements. If somebody says that their goal or if their statement is, I can't go back to the streets, and we're attempting to do some evoking, what are some of these, or what examples of ors might you put in place here, right? Remember, the key question of evoking is why, right? Why would you make this change? And so if you have an example, I would love to kind of hear your example. If a participant said this to you, it's the same goal as we talked about before, right? I want to stay housed, but this is the next statement. I can't go back to the streets. What's your response? How are you responding to this one using either an open-ended question, an affirmation, reflective listening, or summarizing? Maybe give me one of each if you can. We'll give a couple moments for folks to type. Yeah, Khalil, the fast fingers. You've worked so hard to get where you are right now, right? I hear a bit of a reflection and an affirmation here, right? I can't go back to the streets. Means the reflection that I'm hearing is like, I've come so far. right? But also you're a hard worker is what you're affirming there. You've been working so hard to stay away from the streets, putting in all the work. So what's the plan moving forward to make that happen? I like it. I think that might be an example. Anthony, I love your reflection, and I love that you're using an open-ended question. And I also think I'm hearing an example of probably focusing, right? The previous task where it's like, what's the goal? Or like, what's the plan? What's the plan to get there? It might even be jumping ahead. Focusing on evoking the why, right? What's so important about this to you? Um, I see another statement. Would you like some tools that will help you not to go back on the streets? First of all, I love that you're bringing your own expertise into the conversation. Um, and you're asking for consent there, right? Can I share some ideas? I think we're getting ahead of ourselves though, right? And I think this is why this task we're leaning on it so hard in this training, because it feels like we're going too slow, right? You're like, the person's like, I can't go back on the streets. And you're like, well, obviously that would suck to go back on the streets. And so what are we going to do about it? And I think we need to slow ourselves down, right? We need to say, you know, what's so bad about living on the streets, right? Because we're asking why, right? What are you trying to get away from? What would it look like to move um, into stable housing for a long term, right? How does that match what you want in your life? Here we're asking about values, we're asking about reasons for change. I get that it feels like almost weird or backwards to like go into this depth. If somebody says that they want to make a change, why are we spending so much time asking them why? And I think it's because if we're not careful, we do a little too much assumption, right? Too much assuming reasons of why. I'm going to project all the reasons why I don't want to go back on the streets. I got a cozy bed. I got a king size bed right behind me, and that's where I want to sleep tonight, right? But that might not be the reason this person wants this change, right? And so the more we can hear about their reasons, the stronger their motivation to make that change will be. Cool. All right. Thank you for putting in some examples, folks. And sorry for preaching at you there for a moment. Okay. The final task of motivational interviewing is the task of planning. Um, uh, what was coming to mind as Khalil was kind of going over evoking just now was we're presenting this in a very linear way, right? First you engage, then you focus, then you evoke, and eventually you'll get a chance to plan. And so maybe a little bit contradictory to what I was just saying, this stuff is going to be intermixed together, or we're going to go back and then go forward, and we're going to go forward and then back. But in general, it's going to take this shape, right? Where we engage first, then we focus on goals, we ask them why, and then we get to the planning, which is asking them how. So where the evoking is the why, the planning is the how. And the key question that we're trying to answer in this task is, how will you get there, right? The how of change. A second kind of question that we're kind of asking of folks, or like what's implied in this question, is knowing what you know about yourself, maybe what challenges you faced, what trauma you've experienced, um, what your personality type is, what your values are, as we just talked about. What do you think it will take for you to make this change? Again, here we are allowing people to demonstrate that they are experts of their own lives. They know themselves better than we do. And so here we might be tempted to say, okay, I get it. You want to stay house. You are not going back on the streets. You want to make sure you pay your rent on time. I'd like to suggest a budget. Not a bad idea, but it's not really allowing their expertise to guide them or to guide the process, right? It's our expertise that's guiding the process there. And so we want to give back that power, right? We want to shed that power and allow people to make this plan themselves or more in collaboration with us. So it has to be their plan that they were involved in crafting. If it's all us, I think the motivation is going to wane, right? Because they're following, we're telling them what to do. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but the change is going to have to be practical and realistic. And so it has to fit into their daily patterns and routines in some way. It has to fit them as a person. A bunch of skills that we see here. We're going to do a lot more summarizing in the planning section, right? We haven't talked as much about summarizing. It is a little difficult to kind of get across the skill of summarizing in the context of a training like this, because what's really necessary to practice this skill is to kind of have a call and response for like several minutes, and then you can summarize statements. But summarizing is key here. This skill of testing the water is really about understanding when is the right time to move from the why to the how. And we saw in the chat, folks were ready to kind of jump into the how. Folks are ready to plan. And if we're not careful, if we jump the gun there, we might actually drain away some of the motivation. We might be moving too quickly. We're reminding ourselves to avoid the fixing reflex here. Ooh, I know what to do. You need to do this, right? And then some other key skills that we'll go over are brief action planning, negotiating change plans, and then evoking hope and confidence. So let's talk about the why, moving from the why to the how. In order to sort of move from that last section that Khalil was taking us through into the planning process, the planning task, we need to be really aware of some signs of readiness. And so how do we know when it's time? Number one, and this is more of a vibes check, really, I want to say. And so your clinical expertise, your knowledge of the person, your long experience doing your work is going to guide you here. But when there is a perception of a persuasive why of change, when somebody gives you a really good reason why they want to make this change, that's often a pretty clear indicator of readiness, right? So if somebody says, I don't want to go back to on the streets, and we start asking them why, and they're like, well, it's cold out there. Okay, that's I get it. That's pretty like broad. We might all feel the same way, right? But if somebody says, I've been living on the streets for 15 years and I've never had the experience of living in my own apartment, and I don't feel like I'm a complete person, and I feel like I haven't moved into the adulthood that I was expecting, and it's been really devastating for me, they've given you like a lot to sit with, right? That is a persuasive why of change. When somebody gives you all of that why and it's very clear and powerful, that's often a pretty good indicator. Like, okay, it's time to move into the how. When you start to hear increasing change talk, right? And earlier in this process, we might hear change talk mixed in with sustained talk, all the reasons for change, all the reasons for the status quo. But when the balance starts to tip towards more examples of desire, ability, reasons, and need to change, that's a good indicator for us, right? When sustained talk starts to decrease, the flip side of this, right? They're not giving you all the reasons why they need to stay stuck here anymore. It's really just the change talk statements. Yes, let's move forward. Here's the vibe check piece that I mentioned earlier, and I wonder if folks in the chat, if this is familiar to you, this feeling, but you can almost sense in people that feeling of resolve, a greater sense of peacefulness and quiet. And what I mean by quiet is like the anxious mind is not running as much, trying to figure out reasons for staying the same. It's like, yeah, we did that values exercise that Khalil walked us through, and like self-determination is my key value. I just said that, like aligning that value with this change that we've been talking about. Yeah, I feel ready. Like that sense of ease that can be there. So that's harder to kind of train on, but I bet you're familiar with that feeling. And then we can also ask questions to, oh, sorry, that's not us. It's when the participant starts to ask us questions about change, right? They might say like, well, what's it going to be like 3 months from now? Are you still going to visit me in the apartment? Are you going to leave me there alone? I wonder what it will be like to not see all my people on the streets anymore. They're asking questions about change because they're starting to envision what the next part of their life is going to look like once they've made this change. When people start to imagine the future on their own and ask questions about it, that's a pretty cool sign of readiness. Yeah, envisioning. Um, when people start making statements about taking steps, you know, I think I'm gonna start saving up like little by little, maybe just like $10 a week I can put under the mattress. They're already starting to take steps. That's a good sign of readiness. And then finally, want to kind of share this skill of testing the water. And it's not that deep, but what testing the water is just asking key questions, right? You've been talking all this change talk, and I might say, so what do you think you'll do? What are you considering at this point? What might be a next step? How do you want to proceed? We're not saying it's time to set a goal or it's time to make a plan. We're saying to you, we've done a bunch of work so far. We've talked about you so far. We've talked about your reasons. What do you want to do now? And when
Yeah.
somebody is able to say on their own, this is the change I want to make, and I'm ready to take a step, the motivation is quite high at that point. Did you want to add something, Kalo?
Just there's an important statement in the chat, and I asked this also crossed my mind, and like I've heard this verbiage before in another space, right? When we're talking about suicide. So RC Weber in the chat shared that these bullet points sound a little bit like what someone might be doing when they're gearing up for suicide, right? But I want to say that we won't hear as much, if any, change talk when someone is talking about wanting to end their life, right? There is more of like a flatter affect, and this is going to look different for everybody, right? But the desire to change, the ability to change, is like less believable. We don't think, we're not hopeful, we're not as confident in any change in our life, and that's going to be different. And I think just in the helping space, like as a helper, like you will be able to pick. Motivational interviewing is not crisis response, right? When someone is suddenly very different in those ways that you're describing and thinking, um, we're not using motivational interviewing to talk somebody out of suicide, I think is what I'm trying to say. And while the language sounds similar, right? And like, I feel like a little bit of like relief and I'm getting ready to make some change. What a participant is saying to you is probably going to be the most important to pick up on here and to be able to like make that distinction. Um, yeah. Anything
Yeah,
else there,
yeah.
Ryan?
I wanted to add that like I actually think you're like kind of on point, RC, that like if we conceptualize suicide as like a major change in a person's life, you're right. All
Mhm.
of these things will indicate some readiness. And so perhaps that's just an even stronger reason why we need to be so aware of darn cat, right? Like all that language of change, because in that context, if we are not listening closely, we may be missing those key crisis response moments. So yeah, I don't think you're not off. Um, yeah. Okay, want to talk to you about uh, when we're in the goal planning phase, when we're in planning as a task. There is an intervention that's been used mostly in like medical settings that kind of lets us start to ask about readiness for change while simultaneously starting to begin a planning process, right? So it's called brief action planning, and there's only 5 steps to it, which I love. I love when there's like a couple of quick steps for an intervention that allow us to like kind of move quite quickly and quite far. So after we've done some like engaging, focusing, and evoking, we might ask a question like number 1 here. Is there anything you'd like to change in the next week or two? Right. And so we're tying that to the conversation that we just had about reasons for change, the why, and the where are we going task. Related to all that, is there anything you want to change in the next week or two? In that week or two, thing is really important because we're not talking about wholesale change all the time. In this case, we're talking about steps, right? A small step, it can be an important part to a larger change process. The second part of this is we can ask the question, would you like to develop a concrete plan? right? We're asking about that concrete plan. And here is where we bring in our expertise around making a SMART goal, right? And so we can even frame the question, would you like to develop a concrete plan? Great. We'll ask about something specific. We'll ask, how do you know we've achieved it, right? Adding in some measurability there. We're adding time frame, et cetera, et cetera. Number 3, we're going to restate the plan in their own words. It's their plan, and we're going to give them their words right back to them so they can hear it out loud. Then we'll assess their level of confidence, right? And Khalil's going to talk us through the confidence ruler in a little bit, but we can kind of use, again, a 1 to 10 scale. How confident do you think you are about making this change in the next 2 to 3 weeks or the next week or two? And then we'll ask a little about what would help their confidence. And finally, in this brief action plan, we can ask if they want any accountability, right? Would you like to build in some accountability? Maybe we could include a friend to check in with you or a family member. Maybe we can put calendar entries on our phones together. Maybe follow up with the team would be helpful. Would you like some accountability steps? And when we can build all of that in, all the 5, we're likely to see some rapid change, right? But again, it relies on the foundation that we've already set. We've engaged folks, we've focused, we've done some evoking, and now we're ready to plan. All right, Khalil, I think this is for you to talk about negotiating a change plan.
Awesome. So this is also in the planning task, right? And if you remember a few slides ago, we talked about looking back and looking forward. The first thing we want to be able to do, or one of the first things, is to elicit what's been tried before, right? We're looking back. And what's worked for you before? What's worked in this situation? What's gotten you through a specific hard feeling, right? Or specific like harder circumstance. And again, they're going to start naming some change talk here. And then the next bullet point I think is really important, generating new ideas without evaluating them. If you think back to the bubble sheet example Ryan was giving, we want to be able to think as broad as possible. We don't have to like put limits on what might make this change possible. We just want to list everything that we can think of, right? And then start narrowing the list down, right? And talk about which of these things sound like a good place to start, right? Or what sounds like the most accessible right now, right? Again, we're going to talk about confidence a little bit more in the next slide, but where do I have the most confidence in being able to start, right? Might be a way that we are navigating this as well. And this is an example, again, of moving from general to specific. Here are all the reasons, here are all the ways I might be able to like pursue a specific change or a goal in my life, right? Which of these things feel the most accessible to me right now is probably going to be the important question to be asking. And then we want to be really listening for that commitment language, right? I always appreciate talking about commitment and hearing about commitment in these spaces because I like to practice therapy from a framework called acceptance and commitment therapy, which deals a lot with values and committed action, right? But the C in CAT is going to stand for commitment, right? This is going to be the expressed promise to change, right? This is a participant saying, I'm feeling really motivated. It probably is never going to be as explicit as that, right? But like, I'm feeling really prepared, right? Or I promise, or I swear, which can feel kind of not good, maybe hearing, because we know that persuasion doesn't really work for folks who want to make big changes in their life, and then they need to want that for themselves. But sometimes being in healthy relationships to others is maybe what pushes us in that direction, right? I love to think about the idea of healing being relational. It's probably something I've shared in other trainings with this group, but that is the context I think about when a client says, I promise you that X, Y, and Z. And you know what? It's not important that they're promising me, but they're promising me that they are going to commit to one of their goals in their life. And that is probably the most important piece there. So again, being able to listen for that language and pick up on it as it comes up. And then the next piece is going to be evoking hope and confidence. And we had a whole section about the evoking task, but this exists in the planning section because we want to specifically be evoking hope and confidence about the specific plan that we're moving forward with, right? So we've talked about the importance ruler. This is the confidence ruler, and it's going to be used in a similar way, right? How confident are you that you can make this change? And it might not be as, it might not line up with how important a change is for somebody, right? On the importance ruler. But let's say somebody is saying, I'm about a 4 again on the confidence ruler. Let's say 5, right? What we want to do to be eliciting some change talk around the plan moving forward is to ask them, why not a 1 or a 2, right? Why do you exist at a 5? And then we want to be identifying and affirming strengths, right? Because if anything's going to bolster somebody's confidence to complete or move toward a specific thing that's been really hard for them, it's going to be important to be naming how they can do that, the strengths you've seen them execute and utilize before in their lives, and really affirming those things for them, right? And that might be what really helps to boost the confidence of somebody in committing to a change in their life. And then again, we have the idea of looking back, right? Reviewing past successes. How did you move through something like this before? And all right, we have another practice slide. This is actually our last practice slide, so give it all you got. In using our skills to plan, how would we use ors to respond to something that sounds like, I promise I'm going to pay my rent? You just know folks are writing really brilliant responses right now. I promise I'm going to pay my rent. It's great that you're committing to paying your rent. Maybe we should work on a budget for you. Yeah, I think you're highlighting the commitment here, right? I'm gonna pay my rent. And being curious about next steps forward, I think is really good. I think we might call that directional reflection, right? It's like maybe we go about it in this way, right? And being open to a participant saying, actually, maybe not. We have another one that says reflection. I see that paying for your rent is important to you, followed by a follow-up. Can we make a plan together to accomplish that? Yeah. I think that hits planning on the head, right? What are we going to do to get there to help you like commit to this thing that you're already saying you're committed to, right? Tell me about your plan to make that happen. How can I support you in that? Yep, I think that really speaks to the idea of goals not being goals until they're shared, like Ryan was naming in the beginning of the training. And tell me about your plan to make that. Oh, okay. These are the same message. But is your rent due and what will we do to get it paid? Budgeting could be a good step. Have you ever done a budget? Yeah, I think that this one, Anthony, is offering some specific ways to explore moving forward, right? Our participant is promising to pay their rent. How are we going to do that? What can we do? What's worked for you before? That idea of looking back, I see in this statement as well. Alrighty, we're short on time, Ryan.
Yep. Here, let's just like close it out. Just to close out the whole session, remembering that motivational interviewing is semi-directive. We are helping people move. It's not passive. We want to avoid those traps. Engagement, that rapport building is the foundation of the change process, and we're going to use it all throughout. And then as we've tried to hammer home, using ors to elicit and strengthen all of that change talk is one of our key skills. Alrighty, I am dropping a link to our session evaluation in the chat right now, and I'll follow up with some some materials, a copy of our slides and this follow-up material. But there's another link to a supplemental document that we've found helpful. We want to thank you all so much for being with us for this 3-part series, and looking forward to next Wednesday where we jump into a harm reduction series, which is our favorite thing to talk about. So we hope to see you there.
See you, everybody. Take care.
Oh, you're muted, Laura.
I'm going to leave this up here for a few minutes so everybody can get those links. But I appreciate everybody coming today, and I appreciate the participation.